Welcome to the debate on pod accounting. And right up front, we should mention that this is an activity of the graduate program in accounting at UFPA, the Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências Contábeis da UFPA.
Yes, absolutely.
Today, we are looking at the research of Arlindo Menezes da Costa Neto, supervised by Luis Carlos Marques dos Anjos. The title of this 2025 research is Machine Learning and Readability in Accounting, an ensemble learning approach.
And it tackles a really relatable problem. I mean, think about the last time you opened a massive corporate annual report.
Right.
You're staring down, 150 pages of dense, microscopic text filled with incredibly complex financial jargon. And when you see that mountain of paper, you have to wonder, do you feel fully informed, or do you instinctively feel like management is just, trying to drown you in paperwork to hide something terrible?
Which is a totally fair question. For decades, the assumption in financial markets has actually been the latter, that massive volume is essentially a smokescreen.
Exactly.
But today, we are looking at an artificial intelligence model that suggests we might have had it entirely backwards. So the central debate emerging from this thesis is this. In highly regulated corporate environments, does textual volume indicate a deliberate attempt to obfuscate bad news, or does it genuinely represent a denser, more informative disclosure?
Right.
I will be arguing that this thesis successfully proves the completeness paradigm, meaning, in these highly regulated environments, larger and more expansive files genuinely equate to higher informativeness and semantic density. The volume is the value.
And I will be taking the opposing view. My position is that while an AI model might mathematically correlate to file size with semantic density, that does not disprove the obfuscation hypothesis, because an avalanche of data might score perfectly on an algorithmic rubric, but it can still obscure the true economic realities from human investors.
Well, let's start with how we have historically measured the quality of financial text, because the baseline is, frankly, kind of embarrassing.
It really is.
For years, accounting research relied on traditional linguistic formulas, things like the Flesch-Kincaid score or the Gunning-Fogg Index.
Metrics originally designed to figure out if a textbook was appropriate for a fifth grader.
Right, exactly. They essentially just count syllables and sentence lengths. I like to think of them as a lazy bouncer at a nightclub, who only checks if you are wearing a tie, completely ignoring how you're actually behaving inside.
That's a great way to put it.
They penalize any text that uses long, complex words. But in our field, phrases like derivative financial instruments or fair value measurement, those are inherently complex, polysyllabic terms.
And we want to see them in a financial report.
Exactly. So the author analyzed over 26,000 Brazilian financial reports from 2011 to 2023 using a highly sophisticated language model called FinBERT-PT-BR. And this research proves that those traditional metrics are fundamentally flawed for accounting.
Well, I agree that traditional metrics are certainly rudimentary. And the author proves this by putting them head-to-head against the Loughran-McDonald Index, which we usually just call the LM Index.
Right, the LM Index.
But the LM Index is essentially a measure of total file size. It just counts the total characters and words.
Yeah, but it's how the author proved the LM Index is superior that is so fascinating to me. They used machine learning regressors, specifically random forest and gradient boosting models, and then they ran feature importance tests like the mean decrease in accuracy.
Let's clarify that for a second. For those outside the data science realm, mean decrease in accuracy is basically a stress test for the AI. You build a predictive model, and then you deliberately blindfold it to one specific piece of data.
Right, you take something away.
Exactly. If you remove a variable, say the Flesch-Kincaid score, and the model's accuracy doesn't really drop, you know that variable wasn't doing much work. But if you remove a variable, and the model suddenly gets terrible at its job, that variable was highly important.
And the study also used SHAP values, which is another way of breaking down exactly how much credit each variable deserves for the final prediction. Across the board, whether using mean decrease in accuracy, mean decrease in impurity, or those SHAP values, the LM Index was overwhelmingly the most powerful predictor.
Oh, it completely crushed Flesch-Kincaid.
It did, because the LM Index captures the total informational footprint. It doesn't penalize a company for using big accounting words. It assumes that if a company is writing more, they are providing necessary, substantive content.
See, I have to challenge that exact premise right there. The idea that sheer volume equals substantive content. Let's upgrade the classic haystack analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you're an investor, you're looking for a needle. You want to find the vital indicators of financial health, cash flow realities, or the risk of default. If a company adds 50 extra pages of routine, copy-pasted regulatory explanations, what have they actually accomplished?
Well, they've provided context.
No, they have increased the size and the weight of the haystack. Yes, the LM index goes up. The file size is objectively larger, and the AI registers more characters and flags it as more information.
Because it is more information.
But dumping an extra ton of hay on top of the needle makes it drastically harder for a human being to find what actually matters. The LM index is acting as a proxy for sheer verbosity. It basically rewards a company simply for buying ink by the barrel.
I mean, I would agree with your haystack analogy if the AI were simply dropping the PDF on a digital scale and measuring its weight.
But it isn't doing that.
It's counting characters.
But the machine learning model actually read the text to evaluate its quality. This is where we really have to look under the hood, at the info index. That's the custom metric the author created to define what informativeness actually means.
Right, turning abstract concepts into math.
Exactly. It evaluated the text across 3 rigorous dimensions: boilerplateness, completeness, and density. Let's look at boilerplateness first, because it directly counters your haystack argument. The model used cosine and Jacquard similarity to measure how much of the text was just copy-pasted junk. Jacquard similarity is actually a great concept to unpack here. Imagine you take the financial report from 2022 and the report from 2023. You dump all the unique phrases from each report into 2 separate buckets.
Okay, 2 buckets.
Jacquard similarity looks at how many phrases exist in both buckets. If the overlap is, say, 90%, the company's just changing the dates and republishing the same boilerplate text.
Right, and the study found that the larger texts, the ones scoring high on the LM index, were actually bringing in new original wording year over year. They weren't just repeating boilerplate.
Fair enough. It catches pure copy-paste repetition. I'll give you that. But let's look at the completeness dimension of this info index, because this is where algorithmic interpretation sharply diverges from human utility.
How so?
Well, to measure completeness, the study used a technique called k-means clustering.
Which is essentially grouping. The algorithm scatters thousands of sentences across a virtual table and pushes similar ones into distinct piles or clusters based on their topics. So it maps the sentences to specific international financial reporting standards, the IFRS topics.
It maps them, yes. And then it applies Shannon's entropy to measure the balance of the report. Now, Shannon's entropy measures how evenly a distribution is spread out.
Right.
So the algorithm rewards a financial disclosure with a high score if it achieves high entropy, meaning it discusses all the different IFRS topics evenly. A perfectly balanced report gets a gold star for completeness.
Because a balanced report means the company isn't ignoring mandatory disclosure requirements in certain areas of their operations. It's a sign of thoroughness.
But think about the reality of a business in severe distress. Imagine a company that is bleeding cash or facing a massive existential lawsuit that threatens to bankrupt them. Shouldn't their financial disclosure be heavily unbalanced?
Well,
The report should be overwhelmingly focused on explaining that specific, urgent crisis to the shareholders.
so you're suggesting the algorithm punishes them for focusing on the fire burning in the kitchen.
It absolutely punishes them. To satisfy a machine reader optimizing for Shannon's entropy, a company is mathematically incentivized to dilute the critical information about the lawsuit by equally distributing their word count across all the routine, mundane IFRS topics.
I see your point, but
The algorithm thinks a perfectly balanced report from a failing company is highly informative, but a human investor would look at that balanced report and see a massive red flag. It is a deliberate dilution of bad news.
I concede that a rigid interpretation of balance could theoretically penalize a highly focused crisis report, but that assumes the algorithm is meant to replace human judgment rather than provide a baseline measurement of disclosure quality across thousands of companies.
Baseline is the key word there.
Right. If a company only talks about one crisis and ignores all other mandatory disclosures, they are failing their stewardship role. The completeness dimension ensures the baseline is met. And we have to look at the density dimension too. The model doesn't just look for topics, it hunts for explanatory depth.
You mean the explanatory cues?
Yes, it scans for causal words, things like due to, in reason of, resulted in. It looks for temporal comparisons explaining year-over-year changes. It quantifies how often the text references specific parameters, like discount rates or valuation assumptions.
Okay.
The data showed that the longer texts had significantly more of these rich explanatory elements. They were dense with context.
But context generated by whom and for what purpose? We really have to bring human behavior back into this equation.
Which leads us directly to the environment this data comes from. The study analyzed the Brazilian market from 2011 to 2023. Brazil fully adopted IFRS in 2010. This is a highly prescriptive, heavily regulated emerging market characterized by significant information asymmetry.
It is an environment where investors naturally distrust the numbers without extensive narrative backing.
Exactly. And the finding that longer texts equal higher info index scores signals a paradigm shift for how we view managers in these markets. It challenges the classic agency theory assumption.
Agency theory.
Right. Agency theory usually assumes that if management is writing a 150-page complex document, they are acting in their own self-interest, using complexity as a tool to hide poor performance from the principals, the shareholders.
A theory that has held up quite well over the years, I might add.
Sure, but this research suggests something different. In this specific regulatory context, managers are writing longer notes out of a genuine desire and a regulatory requirement to provide detailed narrative explanations of their accounting estimates. When they write more, they're actively trying to bridge the information gap.
You think they're genuinely trying to help?
See, the FinBERT-PT-BR, LACT as our simulated reader, confirms that this extra volume carries heavy semantic weight. It proves that in a post-IFRS emerging market, compliance actually generates substance. The completeness paradigm is real.
I view the behavioral motivations through a much more skeptical lens, honestly. Agency theory is still very much alive. It has just adapted to the technology. The study itself actually issues a profound warning about this very dynamic. We are entering an era of weaponized compliance.
So you are saying that by knowing the grading rubric of the algorithm, executives will just write to the test? Like search engine optimization for financial disclosures?
That is exactly what they will do. Think about the incentives here. If managers know that market participants, regulators, and automated trading algorithms associate volume, checklist completeness, and semantic density with high quality, they will engineer thick, dense texts.
They'll game the system.
Yes. They will ensure every single IFRS topic gets its perfectly balanced paragraph to maximize Shannon's entropy.
They will artificially inject the explanatory cues.
Absolutely. They will pepper the text with phrases like due to and estimate because they know the natural language processing tools are scanning for them. They can construct a document that is fundamentally impenetrable to a human retail investor, an absolute nightmare of dense jargon, but acts as a perfect key to unlock a high score from a large language model. The obfuscation hasn't disappeared. It has just been optimized to trick the machines.
Look, I understand the fear of executives gaming the system. I do. But that view underestimates the sophistication of the NLP revolution we are witnessing right now. We aren't talking about a simple script running a dictionary keyword search.
It's still a machine.
But the model used here, FinBERT-PT-BR, is built on a transformer architecture. It relies on self-attention mechanisms.
The mechanism that allows the AI to weigh the importance of surrounding words.
Let's use an analogy. The old readability formulas, like we discussed, are the lazy bouncers checking IDs. A basic keyword search is like a clerk simply checking items off a list, but a transformer model with self-attention is like a seasoned detective analyzing a room.
Okay.
It doesn't just see the word derivative and check a box. It understands that the word derivative means something entirely different when it is standing next to financial instrument versus when it is standing next to calculus equation. It understands the contextual weight of the words based on their mutual relationships within the sentence.
It grasps the syntax in the localized context.
Exactly. It is incredibly difficult to game a third-generation text embedding model. If a manager is writing highly complex, convoluted sentences to hide bad news, the semantic richness of those sentences still conveys the underlying economic complexity to the machine. The model isn't being fooled by a few extra due to phrases thrown in randomly. It is successfully decoding the complexity of the narrative.
It is successfully decoding the semantic structure. Yes, I'll agree with that. But it cannot decode economic intent. And that is the crucial blind spot.
Intent?
Yes. A manager can use beautifully structured, semantically rich, grammatically flawless Portuguese to explain why a catastrophic drop in revenue is actually just a strategic temporal realignment of asset flows.
Well, a creative spin.
A highly sophisticated spin. The algorithm reads that sentence. It sees the cross-references. It sees the temporal comparisons. It runs the Jacquard similarity and sees it isn't boilerplate. So it scores the text as highly informative and incredibly dense.
Right.
But a human investor reads that same sentence and instantly realizes the manager is lying through their teeth. The human sees the spin. The algorithm just sees high-quality syntax. That is the inherent danger of equating algorithmic informativeness with true decision-useful clarity.
But if we reject the algorithmic measurement because it can't detect a lie, what alternative are we left with? If we throw out the Loughran-McDonald Index and this new info index, we fall all the way back to the Flesch-Kincaid score?
Nobody wants that.
We go back to calling a financial report unreadable simply because it uses industry-standard terminology. What this research fundamentally proves is that we finally have a tool that moves past surface-level syllable counting. By breaking informativeness down into boilerplateness, completeness, and density, the author has given us a way to empirically measure the informational footprint of corporate narratives at scale.
That's a fair point.
Textual volume in this environment genuinely brings a semantic richness that the old formulas completely missed.
Look, the methodology is undeniably a massive leap forward. I will not dispute that. Moving away from syllables and toward transformer-based context interpretation is the absolute future of accounting research. And the sheer data wrangling required to pull this off, converting tens of thousands of PDFs via optical character recognition just to build the corpus, is a monumental achievement.
It really is.
My caution is purely about how we apply these findings. We must remain vigilant. Confusing an algorithm's measurement of semantic density with actual decision usefulness carries a profound risk. If regulators and markets simply accept that a larger file is an inherently better file, we risk giving corporate managers a free pass to bury their worst news in an endless avalanche of data, fully endorsed by an AI stamp of approval.
It is clear we are standing at a fascinating frontier. The intersection of natural language processing and accounting is a space that is going to require immense exploration over the next decade.
Without a doubt.
We need to continuously refine our understanding of the divergence between how a machine reads a document to optimize for entropy and density, and how a human being reads that exact same document to make a critical financial decision.
It fundamentally changes how we think about the target audience of a financial disclosure. Moving forward, are companies writing for their shareholders, or are they writing for the algorithms that advise those shareholders?
That is a profound question, and one that brings us right back to that heavy 150-page report landing on your desk with a thud. Whether it turns out to be a detailed treasure map of the company's operations or a highly engineered smokescreen, it is abundantly clear that the tools we use to read it will never be the same.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us for this rigorous exchange of ideas. We look forward to our next meeting on Pod Accounting, where we will continue to explore the leading edge of financial research. Goodbye for now.
Farewell.